There is a conversation about power that most people refuse to have, not because they lack the intelligence to understand it, but because understanding it demands something unbearable, the death of who you thought you were. Machiavelli spoke this truth 5 centuries ago, and the world has been running from it ever since. But what if the dark side of power he described wasn't actually about politics or manipulation? What if it was a map of the human psyche itself, drawn in the language of survival, written for those brave enough to face their own shadow? If you're here because something in you is ready to stop pretending, to look directly at the parts of yourself you've been taught to deny, then this conversation is for you. We're going to explore what Jung called the shadow through the lens of Machiavelli's most controversial insights. And if you find value in this journey of self-discovery, consider subscribing to this channel. We release a new depth psychology exploration every week, designed to help you integrate what you've been avoiding. There's also a pinned comment below with resources to continue this work between videos. Now let's step into the territory most never dare to enter. You've been taught that goodness means softness, that integrity requires you to be harmless, that the spiritual path is paved with surrender, agreeableness, and the constant suppression of your own needs in favor of others. You were told that anger is toxic, that assertiveness is aggression, that boundaries are selfish. So you learned to smile when you wanted to scream. You learned to say yes when every cell in your body was screaming no. You became the person everyone could rely on, the one who never caused problems, the one who absorbed everyone else's chaos so they could remain comfortable. And now, years later, you look in the mirror and see someone you don't recognize, someone exhausted, someone resentful, someone who gave everything away and kept nothing for themselves. This is the cost of denying your shadow. This is what happens when you mistake weakness for virtue. Jung understood something that Machiavelli intuited from a different angle, that the denied self doesn't disappear. It goes underground. It becomes what Jung called the shadow. The repository of everything you've been taught is unacceptable. Your rage, your selfishness, your hunger for power, your capacity for cruelty. These aspects don't vanish because you refuse to acknowledge them. They calcify in the basement of your psyche, waiting. And the longer you deny them, the more they control you from behind the curtain of your awareness. Machiavelli's warning wasn't that people are inherently evil. It was that people who refuse to see their own darkness become puppets to it. The man who claims he has no capacity for manipulation is the easiest to manipulate. The woman who insists she's incapable of cruelty often becomes the cruelest because her cruelty wears the mask of righteousness. When you deny the shadow, you don't transcend it. You empower it. Think of the shadow as a wolf living in the basement of your psyche. You've locked the door. You've pretended it's not there. You've built your entire identity on being the opposite of that wolf. Gentle, harmless, peaceful. But the wolf is still there. And because you refuse to acknowledge it, you can't train it. You can't integrate it. You can't learn to walk with it as an ally. So it scratches at the door. It howls in your dreams. It emerges in passive-aggressive comments, in sudden explosions of rage, in self-sabotage that you can't explain. The wolf doesn't want to destroy you. It wants to be seen. It wants to be integrated. It wants you to stop pretending you're only light. Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. Most people interpret this as a call to cruelty, but Jung would see it differently. What Machiavelli understood, and what depth psychology confirms, is that the person who is only loving, only kind, only giving, becomes invisible. They become a doormat, not because love is weak, but because love without boundaries is not love at all. It's self-abandonment. It's a refusal to honor your own existence. And people sense this. They sense when someone has no bottom, no edge, no line they won't cross. And consciously or unconsciously, they test it. They push, they take, not because they're evil, but because the human psyche instinctively seeks structure. It seeks the presence of someone who knows their own worth. The person who has integrated their shadow doesn't need to be cruel, but they're capable of it. And that capacity, held consciously, becomes the foundation of respect. Here's where the wolf metaphor deepens. Imagine you finally open the basement door. You finally turn to face the wolf you've been denying. At first it's terrifying. It snarls, it bares its teeth. It embodies everything you were taught to fear about yourself. Your capacity for rage, your hunger for recognition, your willingness to say no even when it disappoints others, your ability to cut off relationships that drain you, your desire for power not over others, but over your own life. But as you stand there, not running, not collapsing, something shifts. The wolf stops snarling. It sits, it watches. And you realize this isn't a monster. This is your instinct. This is your life force. This is the part of you that knows when someone is lying, that feels when a boundary has been crossed, that refuses to be diminished. The wolf isn't your enemy, it's your guardian. And the moment you stop rejecting it, it stops controlling you. If this resonates, if you're beginning to see the shape of your own shadow, take a moment to like this video. It helps others find this work, and it reminds the algorithm that depth still matters. You can also save this to a playlist if you want to return to it later. These aren't just ideas to consume once. They're invitations to a process. Now let's talk about what changes when you integrate the wolf, when you stop pretending you're harmless, when you allow yourself to own your capacity for strength, for boundaries, for strategic action. The first thing that shifts is your presence. People feel it before you even speak. There's a groundedness that wasn't there before, a clarity. You're no longer performing niceness to avoid conflict. You're no longer giving endlessly to prove your worth. You're simply here in your full complexity, and that fullness commands a different kind of respect. Relationships change. The people who were drawn to your lack of boundaries begin to fall away. And it hurts at first, because you mistake their departure for rejection. But what's actually happening is a recalibration. You're no longer available for dynamics that require you to be small. And the people who valued you for your smallness can't stay. But the ones who see you, who meet you in your wholeness, they arrive differently. They don't need you to be their emotional servant. They want to walk beside you, wolf to wolf. Machiavelli also warned that men judge by appearances, not by reality. And Jung would agree. We live in a world of projections. People don't see you as you are. They see their idea of you, shaped by their wounds, their hopes, their fears. This is why the conscious wielding of image matters, not as manipulation, but as responsibility. If you've integrated your shadow, if you've learned to walk with the wolf, then your presence will naturally shift. But if you don't consciously shape how that presence is perceived, others will shape it for you. They'll call your boundaries cold. They'll call your clarity arrogance. They'll interpret your refusal to collapse as aggression. This is projection. And while you can't control it entirely, you can become aware of it. You can recognize when someone's reaction to you has nothing to do with you and everything to do with what you represent to their unintegrated shadow. The second return of the wolf comes here. You're no longer in the basement, facing the wolf alone. Now you're learning to walk with it in the world. And this is where discernment becomes everything. The wolf knows who is safe and who is not. It can sense predation. It can feel when someone is testing your boundaries, when they're trying to provoke your collapse back into smallness. And here's the paradox. The integrated shadow doesn't react with aggression. It responds with clarity. It doesn't need to prove anything. It simply holds the line. A single sentence, a single look, the withdrawal of your energy from a dynamic that no longer serves you. This isn't cruelty. This is sovereignty. And sovereignty, when held consciously, is one of the most powerful forces in human relationship. Comment below if you've ever felt the pressure to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. I read every comment, and your reflections become part of the larger conversation we're building here. Let's go deeper into what Machiavelli called the necessity of appearing virtuous while being willing to act otherwise. On the surface, this sounds like hypocrisy, but Jung would recognize it as the dance between persona and shadow. The persona is the mask you wear in the world, the version of yourself you present to meet social expectations. It's not fake. It's necessary. We all need a persona to navigate collective life. But the problem arises when the persona becomes your entire identity, when you mistake the mask for your face. You become rigid. You become fragile. Because the moment someone sees through the persona, the moment they glimpse the shadow you're hiding, you collapse. The integrated person doesn't have this problem. They know the difference between who they are and who they appear to be. They can present strength, kindness, confidence, without being attached to the image, because underneath they've made peace with the wolf. They're not performing virtue to hide their darkness. They're choosing virtue from a place of wholeness. This is where the micro-action begins. Integration isn't a single moment of revelation. It's a practice. So here's what you can do, starting today. First, identify one place in your life where you're collapsing, where you're saying yes when you mean no, where you're absorbing someone else's chaos to keep the peace. Write it down. Don't judge it. Just see it clearly. Second, ask yourself, what would the wolf do? Not in a reactive, destructive way, but in a grounded, sovereign way. What boundary would it set? What truth would it speak? What energy would it withdraw? And third, take one small action in that direction. Send the text. Have the conversation. Stop performing. It doesn't have to be dramatic. In fact, the quieter the action, the more powerful it often is, because you're not trying to prove anything to anyone else. You're proving to yourself that you're capable of honoring your own existence. The third and final appearance of the wolf comes in the closing. You've faced it. You've walked with it. And now you realize the wolf was never separate from you. It was always you, the part of you that refused to be extinguished, the part that knew, even when you didn't, that you were worth protecting, that your life, your energy, your presence mattered. Machiavelli's warning wasn't about becoming a tyrant. It was about refusing to be a victim. Jung's teaching on the shadow wasn't about becoming your darkness. It was about integrating it so fully that you could finally be whole. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to invite you to share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Not everyone is ready for this conversation, but the ones who are will feel it instantly. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. This channel exists to explore the depths that most content skims over. Every week, we go into the places that matter. So here's the truth, Machiavelli whispered and Jung confirmed. The dark side of power isn't actually dark. It's simply real. It's the part of you that knows your worth, that refuses to be diminished, that walks through the world with the wolf at your side, not as a threat, but as a presence. And the moment you stop running from it, the moment you turn and face it fully, you discover something extraordinary. You were never weak. You were never broken. You were just waiting for permission to be whole. And that permission, it never comes from the outside. It only ever comes from you. But let's not stop there, because there's a dimension to this integration that most people miss, even when they begin the work. It's the difference between intellectual understanding and embodied transformation. You can know about the shadow. You can talk about it at dinner parties. You can recognize it in theory. But until you feel the wolf's breath on your skin, until you stand in the basement with your hand on its fur, the knowledge remains abstract. And abstract knowledge doesn't change anything. It just becomes another costume for the persona to wear. Here's what happens in the body when you begin true integration. Your nervous system, which has been in a chronic state of collapse or hypervigilance, begins to find a middle path. You stop swinging between fawning and freezing. You stop performing emotional labor to manage other people's discomfort. There's a felt sense of ground beneath your feet that wasn't there before. You can feel your spine. You can feel your breath moving all the way down into your belly instead of stopping shallow in your chest. This isn't metaphorical, this is physiological. The shadow lives in your body, not just in your concepts. And when you integrate it, your body knows before your mind catches up. Machiavelli observed that fortune favors the bold, but Jung would add a crucial nuance. Fortune favors the integrated. The person who has faced their shadow and made peace with the wolf doesn't operate from recklessness. They operate from groundedness. They can take calculated risks because they're not driven by unconscious compulsions. They're not trying to prove their worth. They're not running from their fear of inadequacy. They're simply moving from center. And movement from center has a different quality. It's decisive without being impulsive. It's strong without being rigid. It's clear without being cruel. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like in everyday life. Imagine you're in a meeting at work. Someone takes credit for your idea. The old you, the one who hadn't met the wolf, would have frozen. You would have felt the anger rising but swallowed it down. You would have told yourself it doesn't matter, that you're above such petty concerns, that the work itself is what's important. And then you would have gone home and felt that familiar ache of resentment, that gnawing sense of being invisible. But the integrated you responds differently. You feel the anger and you don't reject it. You let it inform you. And in that moment, calmly, without dramatics, you speak. You say something simple. Something like, I appreciate you building on the framework I introduced last week. Let's make sure we're crediting sources as we develop this further. It's not aggressive. It's not passive. It's sovereign. And everyone in the room feels the shift. Not because you attacked anyone, but because you honored yourself. The wolf didn't need to bare its teeth, it just needed to be present. This is the dance Machiavelli understood and that most people fear. The dance between appearing virtuous and being willing to act with force when necessary. But here's what gets lost in translation. Acting with force doesn't mean violence. It means presence. It means clarity. It means the willingness to disrupt false harmony in service of truth. Most people spend their entire lives maintaining false harmony. They smooth over tensions. They avoid difficult conversations. They sacrifice their own needs to keep everyone comfortable. And they call this kindness. But it's not kindness. It's cowardice dressed in spiritual language. True kindness requires courage. It requires the willingness to say the thing that needs to be said, even when your voice shakes. It requires the willingness to let people be uncomfortable with you, because their discomfort is not your responsibility. Here's where we need to talk about projection again, because this is where most people get stuck. When you start showing up differently, when you start walking with the wolf instead of hiding it, people will project onto you. They'll call you selfish. They'll say you've changed and not in a good way. They'll accuse you of being cold, distant, arrogant. And if you're not prepared for this, if you haven't fully integrated the shadow, you'll collapse back into the old pattern. You'll think, maybe they're right. Maybe I am being selfish. Maybe I should go back to being who I was. But here's the truth. Their projection is not about you. It's about them. It's about the fact that your refusal to collapse threatens their own repression. It's about the fact that your presence reminds them of their own denied wolf. And instead of facing it, they try to make you wrong for facing yours. Jung called this phenomenon the collective shadow. It's not just individual. It's cultural. We live in a society that desperately needs people to stay small, to stay compliant, to stay nice. Because the moment people start integrating their shadows, the moment they start walking with their wolves, systems of control begin to crack. This isn't a conspiracy. It's just how collective repression works. The system doesn't need to be conscious of what it's doing. It just needs enough people to enforce the unspoken rule. Don't be too much. Don't take up too much space. Don't speak too loudly. Don't want too much. And most people obey this rule without ever questioning it. They call it humility. They call it being a good person. But what it actually is self-erasure. So when you begin this work, when you start integrating the shadow, you're not just doing personal healing. You're disrupting a collective pattern, and that disruption will be felt. People will react. Some will celebrate you. Some will reject you. And some will simply fall away, because the frequency you're operating on no longer matches theirs. And all of this is okay. In fact, it's necessary, because you can't grow into your wholeness and stay in dynamics that require your fragmentation. Now let's return to Machiavelli's most controversial teaching, that the ends justify the means. Most people recoil from this statement because they interpret it as permission for cruelty. But Jung would see it differently. What Machiavelli understood is that moral purity, when taken to its extreme, becomes paralysis. The person who is so afraid of doing wrong that they do nothing at all isn't virtuous. They're just invisible. They've abdicated responsibility. And in abdicating responsibility, they've allowed harm to continue unchallenged. The integrated person understands that sometimes protecting what matters requires you to do uncomfortable things. It requires you to set boundaries that hurt people's feelings. It requires you to end relationships that are draining you. It requires you to make decisions that others will judge. And the question isn't whether you'll be judged. You will be. The question is whether you'll honor your own integrity in the face of that judgment. There's a moment in every person's integration journey where they have to choose between being liked and being whole. And it's excruciating, because being liked feels like survival. It feels like safety. We're wired for belonging. We're wired to fear exile. And so the idea of making choices that might lead to rejection triggers every primal alarm in our nervous system. But here's what you discover on the other side of that choice. Being whole feels like coming home. Being whole feels like you can finally breathe. Being whole means you're no longer performing a version of yourself that you think the world will accept. You're just here, fully imperfectly. And the people who were meant to find you will find you not despite your wholeness, but because of it. This brings us to one final insight that bridges Machiavelli and Jung in a way that most people miss. Both men understood that power is not something you take from others. It's something you reclaim from yourself. Every time you deny your shadow, every time you refuse to acknowledge your capacity for strength, for boundaries, for strategic action, you give your power away. You hand it over to anyone who's willing to wield it. And then you wonder why you feel so powerless, why your life feels like it's happening to you instead of being created by you. The answer is simple. You gave yourself away. You fragmented yourself to fit into spaces that were never designed for your wholeness. And now the work is to call those fragments back, to integrate them, to become whole again. If you're still here, if these words are landing in your body and not just your mind, then do me one more favor. Turn on notifications for this channel. Because this work doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in community, in conversation, in the ongoing practice of showing up and being witnessed. And every week, we're exploring a different dimension of what it means to become whole in a world that profits from your fragmentation. The wolf is waiting. It's always been waiting. Not to destroy you, but to complete you. Not to make you cruel, but to make you real. And the moment you open that door, the moment you stop running, you'll discover what Machiavelli knew and Jung confirmed. The dark side of power was never actually dark. It was just the part of you that refused to disappear. The part that knew you were worth fighting for. The part that remembered, even when you forgot, that you were never meant to be small. But here's something most people don't understand about this integration process. It's not linear. You don't open the door once and suddenly become whole forever. Integration is a spiral. You'll face the wolf, make peace with it, walk with it for months, and then something will happen. A crisis, a betrayal, a moment of deep vulnerability. And suddenly you'll find yourself back in that basement, staring at the wolf like it's the first time all over again. But here's what's different. You're not the same person anymore. The wolf recognizes you now, and this time, the reunion is faster, the integration deeper, because you're not learning the lesson for the first time. You're learning it at a new level. Jung called this circumambulation, the process of walking around the center of the psyche, viewing it from different angles, at different stages of life. Each time you circle back to the shadow, you see it with new eyes. What terrified you at 20 might become your greatest strength at 40. What you rejected in your youth might be exactly what you need to reclaim in your maturity. The shadow isn't static. It evolves with you. And the work of integration is never truly finished. It's a lifelong conversation between you and the parts of yourself you've tried to exile. Machiavelli understood this in political terms. He knew that the prince who becomes too comfortable in peacetime is the first to fall in war. The moment you stop training, stop preparing, stop acknowledging the realities of power, you become vulnerable. And Jung understood this in psychological terms. The moment you think you've conquered the shadow, the moment you believe you're fully integrated and beyond the work, that's when the shadow strikes from the blind spot you've created. Wholeness isn't a destination. It's a practice. And the practice requires vigilance, not paranoia. Awareness, not control. Let's talk about what this means for your relationships, because this is where the rubber meets the road. When you begin integrating your shadow, when you start walking with the wolf, every relationship in your life becomes a mirror. Some people will celebrate your transformation. They'll say, "I've been waiting for you to show up like this." They'll meet your wholeness with their own, and these relationships will deepen in ways you didn't think possible. But others will resist. They'll pull harder. They'll test your boundaries more aggressively. They'll try to provoke you back into the old pattern because your old pattern was comfortable for them. It required nothing of them. It allowed them to stay unconscious. And your consciousness threatens that arrangement. This is where discernment becomes an art form. Not everyone who resists your growth is toxic. Some people are simply scared. They're watching you do something they haven't found the courage to do themselves. And their resistance is actually an unconscious plea. Show me it's possible. Show me I can do this too. With these people, patience and presence can create transformation. Not by preaching, not by trying to convince them, but simply by continuing to show up in your wholeness. Your example becomes the permission they've been waiting for. But then there are others. People whose entire sense of self depends on your collapse. People who need you to stay small so they can feel big. People who weaponize your compassion, who exploit your empathy, who take your generosity and call it obligation. With these people, patience is not a virtue, it's a trap. And the wolf knows the difference. Here's a practice that bridges Machiavelli's strategic wisdom and Jung's psychological depth. When someone in your life consistently crosses your boundaries, when they continue patterns that drain or diminish you, ask yourself this question: am I staying because there's genuine potential for mutual growth here? Or am I staying because I'm afraid of what it means about me if I leave? That second question is the shadow speaking. It's the part of you that still believes your worth is determined by your capacity to endure, to sacrifice, to prove your goodness through suffering. And that belief is a cage. The wolf doesn't live in cages, and neither should you. Integration also means integrating your capacity for endings. We live in a culture that romanticizes perseverance, that tells us quitting is weakness, that champions loyalty above all else. But Jung understood that death and rebirth are natural cycles of the psyche. Sometimes relationships need to end. Sometimes versions of yourself need to die so that new ones can emerge. And this isn't failure, it's transformation. The person who can only begin things but never end them is just as trapped as the person who can only end things but never commit. Wholeness requires both: the capacity to say yes with your whole heart and the capacity to say no with equal conviction. Machiavelli would remind us that timing is everything. There's a season for building and a season for pruning. There's a time to extend trust and a time to withdraw it. And the person who can't read these seasons, who applies the same strategy to every situation, becomes predictable. And in becoming predictable, they become manipulable. The integrated person is fluid, not because they're inconsistent, but because they're responsive. They read the room. They sense the undercurrents. They know when to be the lion and when to be the fox. And this fluidity, this strategic adaptability, isn't manipulation, it's mastery. Let me leave you with one final reflection. The journey from fragmentation to wholeness, from denying the wolf to walking with it, is not a journey away from your humanity. It's a journey toward it. You're not becoming less feeling. You're becoming more real. You're not becoming colder. You're becoming clearer. And clarity, when it's rooted in self-knowledge rather than self-deception, has a warmth to it, a groundedness, a presence that doesn't need to announce itself because it's simply undeniable. The world needs more people who've opened the door, more people who've faced the wolf and learned to walk with it. Not because the world needs more power-hungry tyrants. We have plenty of those. The world needs people who understand power so deeply that they're no longer corrupted by it. People who've integrated their shadows so fully that they can hold space for others to do the same. People who know their worth so completely that they don't need to diminish anyone else to feel it.